The sun was unforgiving as Malcolm Carter stepped out of his old delivery van, the heat bouncing off the concrete like waves of fire. He adjusted his uniform, ran a rough hand over his sweat-damp forehead, and grabbed the package from the passenger seat. Another day, another delivery. The Whitmore Klein building stood tall in front of him, sleek, modern, wrapped in glass panels that reflected the sky like a corporate fortress. Inside, powerful executives in expensive suits sat in air-conditioned offices, making decisions that shaped markets. Meanwhile, people like Malcolm were invisible to them. As he pushed through the heavy glass doors, the icy blast of central air sent a shiver down his spine. The receptionist, a young blonde woman with perfect nails and a permanent look of disinterest, barely glanced up. "Drop off?" she muttered, already extending a manicured hand for the package. Malcolm placed it on the counter and slid the tablet toward her for a signature. She barely touched the screen before shoving it back, eyes flicking back to her phone like he had already ceased to exist. This wasn't new. The first few times it had stung. Now it was just routine. He turned to leave, but as he walked past the waiting area, a burst of laughter made him pause. "Man, can you imagine if the delivery guy was our boss?" The words came from a man in a Navy suit. Ryan Caldwell, senior executive, walking stereotype of privilege. He leaned back in his leather chair, shaking his head like the very thought was the funniest joke he'd ever heard. The others, 3 men, 2 women, laughed with him, their amusement sharp and easy. Malcolm didn't stop walking, but his jaw clenched. "He's probably used to lifting boxes, not leading meetings," one of the women added, chuckling behind her coffee cup. Another round of laughter. Malcolm kept his steps steady, forced his hands to stay loose at his sides. Years of practice, years of swallowing things down. He was almost at the door when he caught his reflection in the glass. The uniform, the scuffed boots, the delivery scanner clipped to his belt. That's all they saw. And for the first time in a long time, that bothered him. Outside, the heat wrapped around him again, but this time he barely felt it. He climbed into the van, gripped the steering wheel, and exhaled slowly. He wasn't angry. Anger was quick, fleeting. This was something deeper, something sharper. They thought they knew him. They had no idea. And soon they would. Malcolm had seen it happen too many times. A black employee would walk into the office with ambition in their eyes, ready to prove themselves. They worked twice as hard, stayed later than anyone else, handled the toughest projects. Yet when it came time for promotions, their names never made the shortlist. Not the right fit, doesn't have the necessary leadership qualities. Maybe next year. The excuses were endless, but the result was always the same. Whitmore Klein had a hierarchy, an unspoken rule embedded into the very fabric of its system. Black employees were workers, never leaders. They filled the mailroom, janitorial staff, low-level administration, but never the executive floor. The glass ceiling here wasn't just invisible, it was bulletproof. Malcolm had delivered packages to the same black employees for years, watching them train new white hires who ended up becoming their bosses within months. He remembered Andre, a brilliant analyst who had single-handedly saved a multi-million-dollar campaign only to be overlooked for a leadership role in favor of a white guy fresh out of college. Andre left a year later, exhausted and defeated. His replacement? Another black employee who would likely meet the same fate. Malcolm wasn't just a delivery man. He had a mind for business sharper than most of the executives in this building. He spent his nights studying investments, flipping properties, trading stocks, making moves that most of these Ivy League suits wouldn't even understand. But in their eyes, he was just a man in a uniform. Even the security guards got more respect than him, especially Mark, a middle-aged white man who stood by the entrance every morning like he was guarding the gates of heaven. Mark barely acknowledged Malcolm, but he laughed and chatted with white delivery guys like they were old friends. One morning, Malcolm had arrived at the same time as a white FedEx driver. Mark grinned, held the door open for him, and cracked a joke. When Malcolm stepped forward right after, Mark let the door swing shut in his face. It wasn't an accident. It never was. Inside, Malcolm walked past the receptionist, who had a smile ready for a white intern, but didn't even glance up at him. He continued down the halls, passing glass-walled conference rooms filled with white faces. On one screen, a PowerPoint about diversity inclusion was playing. The irony burned. He wasn't angry. He was done being angry. Now he was just waiting. Because he knew something they didn't. They thought they had locked the doors to power. But Malcolm had already found the keys. And soon he was going to walk right in. The dimly lit cafe smelled like fresh coffee and burnt toast, the kind of place where deals were made in whispers and revolutions were born in silence. It wasn't just any cafe, it was Black-owned, a sanctuary in a city where men like Malcolm were seen as nothing more than workers. He sat at a booth in the back, his hands clasped together, eyes scanning the room. He wasn't nervous. He was waiting. The door swung open, and Jason Statham walked in like he owned the place. Not in the arrogant way the suits at Whitmore Klein did. Jason carried a different kind of power. It wasn't about money, though he had plenty of that. It was about presence, a man who walked into any room knowing damn well no one could move against him. Jason didn't waste time. He slid into the booth across from Malcolm and got straight to it. "I heard you got a problem," he said, voice low, rough like gravel. Malcolm exhaled, leaning forward. "Not just me, all of us." Jason nodded. "Whitmore Klein." Malcolm gave a dry laugh. "You already know?" Jason smirked. "Billionaires don't wait for news to come to them. They collect it before it even happens." For a moment, neither of them spoke. Outside, cars rushed past. People went about their lives, completely unaware that a storm was forming in this very booth. Malcolm ran a hand over his face. "I've watched them for years. The way they operate. The way they keep Black employees under their thumb while pretending to be diverse. They think they've locked the system." Jason's jaw tightened. "Then we break the lock." Malcolm stared at him. "You know they'll fight back. They always do." Jason smirked. "That's why you don't fight fair. You fight smart." Malcolm leaned in. "What are you saying?" Jason folded his hands on the table. "I'm saying we don't demand a seat at their table. We take the whole damn table. Yes, we do it quietly." Jason's smirk widened. "Now you're thinking like a businessman." The deal was made with a single handshake, a billionaire's resources and a genius strategist's mind. Whitmore Klein had no idea what was coming. The first rule of war? Never let your enemy see the attack coming. Malcolm knew this wasn't just about proving a point. This was about power, the kind of power racists feared the most. Not protests, not demands. Ownership, control, the ability to make decisions that they couldn't overturn. And he was going to take it from them without them even realizing it. Whitmore Klein had been standing strong for decades, a giant in the corporate world. But Malcolm had been watching, studying, waiting. The cracks in their foundation were already there. Bad investments, overpaid executives, a leadership team too arrogant to see that they were bleeding money. They were comfortable, untouchable in their own eyes. That made them weak. Jason had the money, but Malcolm had the strategy. "Jason," Malcolm said, looking over financial reports spread across his tiny apartment table, "they're already sinking. We just need to push them under." Jason smirked, arms crossed. "Then let's push." Over the next few weeks, Whitmore Klein's slow collapse accelerated, and no one inside the company even realized why. Jason Statham wasn't just a man with money. He was a ghost in the financial world, making moves without leaving fingerprints. Through his network, he pulled strings with key investors, spreading whispers about Whitmore Klein's instability, encouraged high-value clients to quietly withdraw their contracts, funded rival companies, boosting their success while Whitmore Klein struggled. The impact was silent but deadly. By the time Whitmore Klein's CEO, Richard Langford, realized what was happening, it was too late. Profits had dropped, stocks were unstable, board members were panicking, and no one had any idea that a Black man and a billionaire were behind it. While Jason played the game on the outside, Malcolm infiltrated from within. "Então, Whitmore Klein wasn't a publicly traded company, but it had multiple stakeholders, former executives, old investors, people who had put money in but wanted out before the ship completely sank. Malcolm approached them one by one. At first, they laughed at him. A black man in street clothes offering to buy into one of the most prestigious firms in the country? They assumed he was a joke, until he made them offers they couldn't refuse. Money talks, and Jason had given Malcolm enough to speak the loudest. One by one, the deals were made. Signatures on contracts, transfers of ownership, silent victories. And then it happened. Whitmore Klein's executive team sat in their weekly financial meeting, completely unaware that their world was about to change. CEO Richard Langford adjusted his expensive tie, flipping through reports. "Our investors are nervous," he muttered, "but this is just a rough patch. We'll stabilize." His senior team nodded in agreement. No one doubted him. Then his secretary rushed in, face pale. "Sir, you need to see this." She handed him a document with trembling hands. Langford's eyes scanned the page. His face lost all color. His fingers tightened around the paper. "What the hell is this?" he breathed. It was the updated shareholder report. And right there in bold letters was the name Malcolm Carter, majority stakeholder, 30%. Langford's stomach dropped. A black man now owned more of the company than anyone at the table. Langford stood so fast his chair toppled over. "This is a mistake," he muttered. "This is some kind of joke." But the numbers didn't lie. The room was silent. His executives looked at him, waiting for an explanation he didn't have. No one laughed now. Malcolm Carter, the man they had mocked, dismissed, and ignored, was now the most powerful person in the company. And they never even saw him coming. The boardroom at Whitmore Klein was built for power. A long, polished mahogany table stretched across the room, surrounded by high-backed leather chairs, where men in expensive suits made decisions that shaped the future. Decisions that, until today, had never included people like Malcolm Carter. Today, that changed. CEO Richard Langford walked into the conference room with his usual confidence, flanked by his senior executives, Ryan Caldwell leading the pack. The mood was casual, relaxed. They had no idea what was about to happen. "I don't know who called this emergency meeting," Langford muttered as he took his seat, "but I'd love to get back to real business." The others chuckled, leaning back in their chairs, exchanging smirks. Then Malcolm Carter walked in. A few executives glanced up, barely acknowledging him. To them, he was still just the delivery guy. But then he didn't leave. He walked to the head of the table and sat down. The room fell silent. Langford frowned, exchanging confused glances with his team. Ryan let out a chuckle, shifting in his seat. "What's going on here?" Malcolm didn't answer immediately. Instead, he reached into a sleek black folder and pulled out a stack of documents. Then, in a voice as calm as a blade being unsheathed, he spoke. "Effective immediately, I am the new majority shareholder of Whitmore Klein." The words hit the room like a bomb. Silence. The kind of silence that meant no one was laughing anymore. Langford snatched the documents off the table, flipping through them with growing horror. His face drained of color. His hands tightened around the pages. "This is a joke," he whispered. His voice was different now, no longer arrogant, no longer dismissive. He looked up, but Malcolm's face was unreadable. "Aj se tum log mer under kam karaheho." The room erupted into chaos. Executives stumbled over their words. Ryan Caldwell stood so fast his chair scraped against the floor, and Langford shook his head in disbelief. "This is impossible," Langford hissed. "How the hell did this happen?" Malcolm leaned back, completely in control. "You were too busy looking through me to see what was happening right in front of you." Langford slammed a fist on the table. "You can't just—" "I can," Malcolm interrupted, his voice steady. "And I did." Ryan Caldwell's face was twisted in disgust. "This is a goddamn disaster," he spat, You seriously expect us to take orders from you? Malcolm's gaze flicked to him. Ryan, he said smoothly, you already have been. Ryan's mouth opened, but he had no comeback. The reality was sinking in. The black man they had laughed at, dismissed, and mocked for years was now their boss. Langford exhaled sharply, trying to regain control. All right, Carter, you made your little move, but you don't know how to run a company like this, so let's be reasonable. Malcolm tilted his head. Reasonable? Langford nodded quickly. We can find a way to... You want me to be reasonable? Malcolm cut in, his voice cold. Langford hesitated. You mean like when Andre was passed over for a promotion he earned? Or when you let Ryan here run an entire department into the ground while black employees were told they weren't leadership material? Ryan's face flushed red. Langford's mouth opened, but nothing came out. Malcolm tapped the documents on the table. I'm not interested in reasonable. Langford stared at him, truly seeing him for the first time. Malcolm Carter wasn't asking for permission. He was taking what was his, and there wasn't a damn thing they could do about it. The silence in the conference room was thick. Malcolm Carter, the man they had mocked, dismissed, and treated like he was invisible, was now sitting at the head of the table. The weight of his power was sinking in, and the room was struggling to breathe under it. And then the panic started. Ryan Caldwell was the first to break. This is insane, he barked, slamming his fists on the table. His face was red, his breathing heavy. You think you can just walk in here and take over? Malcolm barely looked at him. I didn't walk in, he said calmly. I owned the place before you even realized it was for sale. Langford stood up so fast his chair toppled over, his expensive suit wrinkling in frustration. You arrogant son of a... Malcolm raised a hand. Sit down. Langford froze. Ryan looked like he wanted to explode. Some of the executives shifted uncomfortably in their seats. Others glanced at the door, as if realizing that for the first time in their lives, they weren't the ones in control. Ryan shook his head, letting out a humorless laugh. You really think you're going to run this company? Malcolm let the tension sit for a second before answering. No, he said finally. Ryan smirked. Malcolm leaned forward. I'm going to rebuild it, without you. Before Ryan could respond, the boardroom doors swung open with force, as Jason Statham stepped in. Dressed in all black, a storm in human form. Langford's face went pale. Ryan took a step back, as if instinctively sensing danger. Jason scanned the room slowly, his voice calm but edged with steel. You people thought you were untouchable. Langford opened his mouth, but Jason cut him off with a sharp look. Aj say your office black excellence ka center hoga. The words hung in the air, undeniable, unstoppable. The last piece had fallen into place, and Langford knew it. Ryan was breathing hard, his face twisted in fury. He started, but Malcolm cut him off. You're fired, Ryan. The words were casual, effortless, like flicking dirt off his shoulder. Ryan stumbled back, his brain struggling to process what had just happened. You can't. I can. Malcolm stood up. And I did. Ryan's arrogance shattered into panic. Wait, he said quickly, his voice suddenly lower, desperate. Malcolm, let's talk about this. You already talked, Malcolm said, stepping closer, his voice steady. Every joke, every insult, every time you looked at me and saw nothing. Ryan opened his mouth, but he had no defense. Malcolm leaned in, lowering his voice just enough so that only Ryan could hear. You thought I was beneath you. Now you're beneath me. Ryan couldn't breathe. Security, Malcolm called out. 2 black security guards entered immediately, men who had once been ordered around by Ryan and Langford's people. Escort Mr. Caldwell out of the building, Malcolm said, permanently. Ryan tried to resist, but the guards didn't give him the option. As they dragged him out, Malcolm spoke one last time. Jolog Black Lagon, Kokam Samatid, Aj wo hamar inakrikite lilen mikadahain. The room erupted into whispers, but the humiliation wasn't over yet. Langford, still standing, was shaking with rage. "You think this is over?" he spat. "I built this company. You're nothing without me." Malcolm tilted his head. "Nothing," he repeated, amused. "Funny, I own everything in this room, and you own nothing." Langford lunged forward, but before he could even get close, Jason stepped between them. Langford froze, his breath catching in his throat. Jason's voice was quiet, but deadly. "Make your move, Rich." Langford didn't move. Jason smirked. "That's what I thought." Malcolm turned to security. "Get him out of my sight." Langford's face turned beet red, but he was powerless. The same black security guards who had once been ordered to ignore racism in this building now grabbed the CEO and dragged him toward the exit. Langford screamed, cursed, fought, but it was useless. The doors slammed shut behind him. Whitmore Klein belonged to Malcolm Carter now. For the first time since Malcolm had stepped into this building years ago, there was silence. Then a slow clap, then another, then another. Within seconds, the room was filled with applause. The black employees who had been ignored, overlooked, and silenced for years were now standing, clapping, smiling. Malcolm turned to look at them. For the first time, they weren't looking at him like a delivery guy. They were looking at him like a leader. Jason clapped him on the back. "You did it," he murmured. Malcolm exhaled, letting the moment sink in. Then he smirked. "No," he said. "We're just getting started." Whitmore Klein was no longer just a company. It was a statement, a shift in power so undeniable that the world had no choice but to watch. Malcolm Carter wasn't just a CEO, he was a symbol. And this was just the beginning. By the next morning, news had spread like wildfire. Black man takes over one of America's largest corporate firms. Jason Statham's secret business move shocks the white corporate world. Power shift, the man they mocked is now running the show. Social media exploded. Some people celebrated, calling it justice, payback, history in the making. Others, especially the powerful white elites, were terrified. Because this wasn't just about one company. It was about the system. A system that had kept black men out of power for centuries. And now, that system was cracking. Malcolm and Jason didn't stop at Whitmore Klein. They launched a new corporate empire, a powerful, black-owned business network that focused on funding black entrepreneurs, buying out racist corporations and replacing their leadership, creating jobs and opportunities for black talent. And they weren't asking for a seat at the table. They were building their own damn table. Banks, real estate firms, tech companies. One by one, Malcolm and Jason started acquiring businesses, flipping power structures, and proving a single truth. Black people don't need help. They need power, and we will take it. The corporate world didn't know how to react. The same executives who once refused to hire black people were now lining up, desperate for jobs, willing to work under the very man they mocked. Months later, Malcolm stood in his new headquarters, staring out at the city skyline. This was his world now. Behind him, Jason poured himself a drink, leaning against the sleek conference table. "You ever think this would happen?" Jason asked. Malcolm smirked. "No." Jason chuckled. "And now?" Malcolm turned, his eyes sharp, his presence unshakable. "Now," he exhaled slowly, letting the weight of everything settle. "Ab hum kisi kilia kaam nahi karenge. Ab log hamare le kaam karenge." Jason clinked his glass against Malcolm's. "To the future," he said. Malcolm smirked. "To power." And as they took a sip, a new era had officially begun. One where black men didn't just survive the system, they ran it.